Welcome to the Forgotten Narrator. Alright, let's talk about one of the most elusive and shadow-drenched enigmas buried in the dusty vaults of Warhammer 40k lore, the Pre-Heresy Inquisitorial factions. Before there was a formal Inquisition, before the ecclesiarchy carved its iron grip across the stars, before even the word heresy became synonymous with betrayal against the Emperor, there were other orders, hidden, experimental, and utterly forgotten by most. Whispers in data vaults, half-burnt records on ships that never returned, names struck from history. These weren't just early attempts at control, they were something different, something more dangerous, something the Imperium might still be afraid to speak of out loud. If you've ever wondered who came before the Inquisition we know today, and why their legacy has been buried so deeply it borders on forbidden, you're in the right place. Because these lost orders didn't just vanish, they were erased. And the reasons behind that might change the way you look at the Inquisition forever. Long before the Inquisition became a hammer that struck down heretics in the Emperor's name, there were individuals, silent agents scattered like shadows across the nascent Imperium who were already playing the same game. Not in the open, not with the full authority of Terra behind them, but with a kind of unofficial sanction that only the Emperor himself could have given. These weren't bureaucrats or ministers. They were hunters, observers, and at times executioners. Their existence wasn't recorded in the same way as the formal structures we know today, but fragments point to their operations being very real and very necessary. You have to remember what the galaxy looked like during the Unification Wars and early Great Crusade. It was chaos. Not just political or military chaos, but existential. Rogue psykers, forgotten technologies, warp entities crawling at the edges of real space. It wasn't enough to conquer with armies. The Emperor needed eyes in the dark. People who could root out threats not just on the battlefield, but within the systems being brought into compliance. That's where these forgotten proto-orders started to emerge. Not from ideology, but from necessity. Some fans believe these early agents were recruited from the Emperor's personal retinue, possibly even proto-iterations of what would become the Custodes' Shadow Keepers or the Proto-Assassins. But instead of guarding or killing, their role was information, surveillance, sabotage, even diplomacy in the rare instances where that was an option. Their authority wasn't written, but it was understood. If one of these agents showed up, it meant that the Emperor was watching. There's this old theory that always stuck with me, the concept of the hidden mandate. Supposedly, during the earliest years of the Great Crusade, a small circle of operatives were granted absolute discretion to investigate and eliminate threats that fell outside the scope of conventional warfare. They didn't wear uniforms, they didn't have banners, but they had the Emperor's word. And that was enough. These figures may have moved between the legions, appearing briefly to question, to test, to root out something that others might miss. It was a role that demanded a terrifying level of trust, and just as terrifying consequences when they acted. A lot of people overlook just how experimental the early Imperium was. We think of it now as this rigid, monolithic thing, but back then, it was fluid. Structures weren't set in stone. The Mechanicum was still in negotiations, the legions were adapting, and the Emperor was constantly adjusting his vision to fit new realities. In that atmosphere, it makes sense that secret orders would form and dissolve almost organically. They weren't trying to be remembered. They were trying to be useful. Some scholars and fans believe these early inquisitorial agents might have operated through institutions like the Librarius Divisio, or even alongside the Proto-Astartes units during the unification of Terra. Imagine a battlefield in the wastes of old Earth, and among the Thunder Warriors or early Space Marines, there's one figure who doesn't fit. Not quite a soldier, not quite a commander. Asking questions, taking notes, vanishing after a decision is made. That's the vibe these orders gave off. Always peripheral, always unsettling. The whispers get louder when you look at certain battle reports from the early Crusade. Cases where entire regiments were reassigned or vanished after a campaign. Instances where high-ranking officers were executed not for disobedience, but for something vague like doctrinal instability or unsanctioned relic acquisition. No trial, no ceremony, just removal. And in each of those stories, there's often mention of an unnamed official, a visitor from Terra, or a cloaked figure who arrived before everything changed. That's the ghost signature of these proto-inquisitorial orders. It's worth noting that many of these early agents likely had no idea they were laying the foundation for what would become the Inquisition. They were doing a job, one most people didn't even want to acknowledge existed. The Great Crusade was supposed to be about unity, compliance, the rebirth of mankind. Talking about corruption, mutation, or psychic instability wasn't just taboo, it was counter to the propaganda. So these orders operated in silence. Not because they were ashamed, but because the Imperium wasn't ready to face what they were discovering. And that silence is part of why they've been forgotten. The Imperium has never been good at preserving the legacies of those who work in the dark. Once their purpose was served, or once they saw too much, they were either absorbed into newer, more formal structures or erased entirely. That's the other thing. The fear. These early orders weren't just forgotten because they faded away. Some of them were buried on purpose. We don't have names, not official ones. But there are enough fragments, enough ciphers in old Mechanicum codebanks, enough forbidden scraps in Ordo Archivum vaults to suggest they were real. And if they were real, then they weren't just early versions of the Inquisition. They were something stranger, a reflection of the Emperor's deepest fears. Not about enemies, but about what humanity might become. And maybe that's the reason they were hidden. Because what they saw, what they learned, was never meant for the rest of us. When you really start digging into the hidden history of the Imperium, there's one thing that becomes unsettlingly clear. Terra has always had layers, not just metaphorically, but physically. Beneath the shining towers of the Administratum and the marble halls of the Imperial Palace lies a world of darkness. Tunnels, vaults, forgotten cities, entire civilizations even, buried and sealed off by time and decree. It's in these depths that many believe the earliest prototypes of what we now call Ordo Malleus and even Ordo Sinister began to take shape, not in glory, not in light, but in secret and in fear. We often treat Ordo Malleus like something that emerged from the ashes of the Horus Heresy, as a response to the catastrophic revelation of chaos. But the roots, the very first stirrings of what would become demon hunters and warp exorcists, were already there. If you look into the most obscure records of the Terran catacombs, you start seeing patterns, mentions of unidentified psychic entities, rogue warp phenomena, and containment rituals that predate the heresy by decades, even centuries. These weren't isolated incidents. They were early attempts at confronting something the rest of the Imperium wasn't ready to accept, that the warp wasn't just a tool or a danger. It was a living, hungering thing. There are stories, quiet, heavily redacted ones, of deep sanctums buried beneath the Himalayan mountains, places no civilian, no standard military officer could even dream of entering. Vaults warded not just by technology, but by strange, ancient sigils. That's where the earliest demonological inquisitors, as some call them, might have operated. Maybe they weren't called that. Maybe they had no official name. But they were there, dealing with things even the Emperor didn't want broadly acknowledged. Entities pulled through unstable psykers, breaches in the veil that happened during early warp tests. Some even say these early orders weren't hunting demons, they were studying them. And it's in those same catacombs that we find the earliest mentions of something far more terrifying, the Sinister Protocols. The Ordo Sinister, which eventually came to wield the infamous Psi-Titans, walking weapons fueled by psychic agony, didn't come out of nowhere. That kind of madness has roots. And those roots lead straight into the underbelly of Terra, into experiments conducted on psykers deemed too unstable to serve but too valuable to waste. There's a reason so many of those early archives are sealed by triple-layered encryption and guarded by custodians who don't speak. They're not guarding secrets of war, they're guarding secrets of damnation. There's a particular theory I've always been fascinated by. Some fans believe that the earliest iterations of Ordo Malleus and Ordo Sinister weren't just separate orders that happened to form around the same time. They were born from the same Black Project, a Terran initiative to explore the psychic potential of mankind and its dangers long before the Librarius was ever formalized. In this theory, the division happened later, once it became clear that control and destruction had to be split. One branch began refining warp countermeasures and exorcism techniques. The other leaned into weaponization, no matter the cost. And here's where things get even darker. There are whispers of a place called the Null Bastion, buried somewhere beneath the old Terran spires. It's said to be a facility dedicated entirely to isolating the most unstable psychic phenomena ever recorded. Not destroying them, not studying them, just containing them, possibly forever. Some believe the personnel stationed there were early models for what would become daemon hunters. Humans enhanced not just with training, but with psychic anchors, null fields, and warp inhibitors. Prototypes of a force built not for mass warfare, but for surgical strikes against the metaphysical. But these agents weren't saints. From what little can be pieced together, their methods were horrifying. Entire hab blocks erased when one of their targets manifested. Civilians executed for being within proximity of a contaminated soul. There were no trials, no declarations, just erasure. And yet, without these brutal interventions, some believe Terra might have fallen to the warp long before Horus ever turned. It's a chilling thought that the birth of what we now revere as Ordo Malleus came from actions that would today be considered atrocities. As for the Ordo Sinister, it's harder to find consistent traces. The project was always cloaked in layers of misdirection. Even Titan deployment records from the Dark Age of technology seem to redact anything remotely tied to psychic integration. But we know from later revelations that the Ordo Sinister didn't just appear in M30. The groundwork was there, possibly tied to ancient Terran cults that experimented with warp channeling machines. The Psi Titans themselves bear runic engravings that don't match Mechanicum patterns, suggesting a different origin. One not entirely human. So what does this all mean? It means the first inquisitorial orders weren't just rogue agents playing politics. They were diving headfirst into the abyss, creating institutions and technologies so dangerous, so ethically nightmarish, that the Imperium had no choice but to later rebrand or disavow them. The modern Ordos we know today, the careful, structured, bureaucratic monsters, they're sanitized. The ones that came before, they were the raw nerve of humanity's fear. That's what makes their connection to Terra's depths so fitting. You don't build bright halls for monsters. You bury them, lock them away, and pray they never come back. During the height of the Great Crusade, the Imperium was expanding at a speed and scale that's hard to even comprehend now. Thousands of worlds were being brought into compliance. Sometimes willingly, often not. The Astartes were the spearhead, the hammer that broke resistance. But behind them, in their shadow, came figures no one sang about. They didn't fight in open battle. They didn't raise banners. But their presence was just as deadly. These were the Emperor's hidden agents. Proto-Inquisitors, operating under no official name, no formalized command, but absolutely crucial to the machinery of compliance. Most people imagine the Great Crusade as this grand golden age of reason and unity. But beneath that myth, there was always another layer. The one where entire populations were quietly adjusted before a planet could be officially declared compliant. That meant rooting out rogue psykers before they could destabilize things. It meant identifying religious leaders who might resist the imperial truth. And it meant tracking down mutants, some harmless, others deeply dangerous, who threatened the fragile biological and ideological purity the Emperor sought to enforce. This was the dirty work. The work no one wanted to admit was being done. You'll find references here and there in old campaign logs. A planet brought into compliance faster than expected, but with casualty rates that don't match the official battle. Civilian populations that drop by tens of thousands overnight with no mention of plague or war. Leaders who vanished before negotiations began. When you read between the lines, you start seeing the outline of something else moving alongside the legions. Something that cleaned up loose ends before they could become a problem. And those cleaners, if you believe the fan theories, were the earliest forms of what we now recognize as inquisitorial kill teams. And honestly, it makes sense. The Great Crusade wasn't just a military campaign, it was a cultural and ideological reset. You can't force that kind of shift on thousands of diverse civilizations without pushback. There were entire religions, psychic traditions, and mutant castes that had existed for millennia. You don't just ask them to bow, you silence them, efficiently, quietly. And that's where these agents came in. They weren't soldiers. They were enforcers of an idea, humanity as the Emperor defined it. Some fans have gone so far as to reconstruct what these early task forces might have looked like. Imagine a detachment of 5 or 6 specialists, each trained in different fields. Psykers with sanctioned potential, bio-augment operatives capable of detecting mutations through chemical trace, linguists who could dismantle local cultic dialects, even historians trained to find ideological threats in planetary lore. They'd arrive before or after the legions, slip into the cracks of society, identify the rot, and remove it, all before anyone even realized compliance had begun. And then there's the psyker problem. Even back then, uncontrolled psykers were one of the most dangerous variables on any world, not just because of what they could do physically, but because of what they attracted: warp entities, demons, reality-bending phenomena, the stuff nightmares are made of. So naturally, any world absorbed by the Imperium had to be scrubbed clean of unsanctioned psychic activity. But instead of using force, these early agents would observe, track incidents, monitor for patterns, and when the right moment came, they'd strike. No trial, no announcement, just one less threat to the Emperor's vision. One of the most compelling stories I've come across involves the world of Kondaros, deep in Segmentum Solar. Official records list it as being peacefully integrated during the middle years of the Crusade, with no mention of resistance. But buried in a footnote from an old cartographer's archive, there's a passing reference to 29 psycho-reactive anomalies being expunged in the weeks before formal contact. No mention of who expunged them, no mention of how, just that they were gone. And this pattern repeats across dozens of other worlds. These weren't Astartes operations. The legions didn't work like this. They fought battles. These were surgical removals, deletions. And that speaks to something else entirely, something built to work in silence, with terrifying precision. The role of these proto-inquisitors wasn't just execution. It was identification. They had to decide who posed a threat to the imperial truth. That's a massive responsibility. One that implies access to incredible resources and a level of authority that could only have come from the Emperor himself. No one else would have been trusted with it. Which, again, ties into the idea that these were not just rogue operators, but agents of a hidden directive. Perhaps even a dry run for the Inquisition that would come later. Some believe their mandate might have even extended to monitoring the legions themselves. After all, if psykers and mutants were a danger on human worlds, imagine what a deviation within a Primarch-led legion could cause. There are a few obscure references to internal stabilization teams operating alongside Astartes forces, never in the command chain, always on the periphery, observing, judging, waiting for something to go wrong. What I love about all this is how human it feels, not in a good way, but in that deeply flawed, paranoid way that defines the Imperium. Even during its brightest moments, the Emperor's empire was always watching its own back, always afraid that something might slip through the cracks. And so, these agents were born, not because of trust, but because of its absence. Their story isn't one of glory. It's one of necessary evil. Of people sent to remove what couldn't be allowed to survive, even if that meant sacrificing their own morality. They didn't wear purity seals. They didn't carry relic blades. But they kept the shadows at bay, long before most people even knew those shadows existed. One of the most overlooked but fascinating aspects of the early inquisitorial movements is how deeply involved they were in xenological operations. We tend to think of the Ordo Xenos as something that came later, formalized only when the Imperium finally decided that just killing aliens wasn't enough. That understanding them, manipulating them, even preemptively wiping them out, might actually serve the long-term survival of humanity. But the seeds of that mindset were planted far earlier than most realize. And the agents who first made contact with the alien races of the galaxy didn't do it with a xenophobic battle cry. They did it in the dark, quietly, carefully, and all too often, fatally. During the Great Crusade, the Imperium encountered hundreds, if not thousands, of Xenos species, some hostile, some passive, some terrifyingly advanced. And while the legions were deployed to crush resistance and establish imperial dominance, there was another layer of operations running parallel to the front lines. The Emperor's silent agents weren't just observing the human populations being brought into compliance. They were tracking alien contact zones, studying Xenos ruins, interrogating survivors. In some cases, even communicating with intelligent alien species before the legions arrived to clean up. That's where the real danger started. Not just physical danger, but ideological contamination. These early operatives were, in many ways, the first xenologists of the Imperium. And with that came exposure to things humanity wasn't meant to understand. The minds of alien philosophers, the technologies of species that had mastered the warp in ways even the Mechanicum couldn't replicate. There's a reason some of those early orders disappeared without a trace. They didn't just encounter aliens, they learned from them. And in the Imperium, that's a death sentence. One of the earliest confirmed cases comes from the ruins of the Pale Nexus, an ancient Xenos installation located in what would later become Segmentum Obscurus. Initial logs suggest that a team of Terran agents entered the site before the Ultramarines arrived for pacification. These agents spent over 40 days within the structure, during which time communication ceased entirely. When recovered, they were changed. Not physically, necessarily, but ideologically. They spoke in strange rhythms, referenced non-Euclidean memory patterns, and had abandoned all standard Terran command protocols. They were terminated on site, and the entire structure was glassed. But records of the event exist. Barely. And if that wasn't the early Ordo Xenos, I don't know what was. A lot of people underestimate just how fragile the Imperial truth really was. It wasn't just a rejection of religion. It was a rejection of everything that didn't fit the Emperor's vision of humanity. So when these early agents started uncovering vast alien empires, ancient artifacts that predated mankind, or philosophies that could undermine the entire imperial cultural narrative, they weren't just encountering enemies, they were becoming liabilities. Dangerous ones. And you can bet the Imperium had mechanisms in place to deal with them swiftly and quietly. That's why some fan theories suggest that early Ordo Xenos agents operated under a dual mandate. Study the Xenos, but also suppress the knowledge. Not just from civilians, but from fellow Imperial personnel. That would explain why so many of their findings were buried, destroyed, or locked away in vaults. Even the Adeptus Mechanicus isn't allowed to access. Knowledge was currency. But it was also contagion. There's this chilling case from the early compliance of the Hyrax system. A pre-imperial human population there had coexisted peacefully with a crystalline Xenos species for over 6,000 years. No war, no oppression, just mutual adaptation. When Imperial forces arrived, the local humans begged for the aliens to be spared, citing shared history and symbiotic development. The local governor was willing to negotiate. Then, the black-cloaked agents arrived. Within a week, the entire alien species was exterminated. The governor vanished, and all local records were replaced with documentation stating that the Hyrax species had been genocidal aggressors. It's too neat, too clean, and it reeks of early inquisitorial involvement. Another layer to all this is the concept of predictive xenocide. Some records suggest that certain early orders developed models, psychic, mathematical, or otherwise, to predict which Xenos species would eventually pose a threat to humanity. These weren't immediate threats. These were species that, based on projected technological trajectories or cultural expansion, might someday rival or resist the Imperium. And so, they were wiped out preemptively. Entire civilizations erased because of what they might become. That's not warfare. That's ideology weaponized at a cosmic scale. It's these kinds of stories that hint at why so many early Xenos-related factions disappeared. It wasn't just danger from without, it was danger from within. The more they knew, the more they questioned the black and white doctrine of the Imperium. And questioning, in this regime, is its own kind of heresy. So they were silenced. Maybe even hunted by other proto-orders, ones tasked with preserving the purity of the Imperial narrative. Ordo Xenos versus Ordo Hereticus, before those names even existed, and yet fragments of their work survive. The Xenologist codices, for example, are said to be built on notes taken from pre-heresy field missions. Some of the most secure vaults on Mars contain xenotech that no Mechanicum priest will admit to studying. And deep within the Black Library, not the Eldar one, but the Terran-adjacent, mythologized version, are texts so ancient and so suppressed that they could only be read by those who already know what's inside. That's where the ghosts of these lost orders linger, in half-erased data entries, in weapons that don't match any known design, in doctrines that contradict everything the ecclesiarchy now teaches. They weren't just Xenos hunters, they were explorers, linguists, philosophers, scientists, and maybe that's what doomed them. Because in the Imperium, the line between understanding and corruption is razor thin. And if you spend too long studying the alien, you risk becoming something the Imperium can no longer trust. This is where the story turns from mysterious to horrifying. If the early agents of the Inquisition began by probing the unknown edges of alien contact and internal heresy, then it was their contact with chaos, the raw, screaming madness beyond the veil, that changed everything. It broke many of them, transformed others, and it forced the Imperium to do something it's never comfortable with: admit that it had underestimated the threat. The sanctioned Inquisition we know today didn't emerge from bureaucratic planning. It was forged in reaction, in desperation, in the blood and silence of the first encounters with the warp unbound. The earliest records are vague, almost poetic in their phrasing. The mind turned inside out, light that does not shine but devours, thoughts that are not mine in the voice of a god I never believed in. These aren't the writings of soldiers. These are the desperate ramblings of humans who saw too much. And yet, these are the scraps that suggest some of the Emperor's earliest operatives didn't just stumble upon chaos. They were the first to realize it wasn't some external force. It was something already inside us. There's a well-known story among Inquisition archivists, though you won't find it in any codex approved for planetary governors. It's called the Archean Protocol. Supposedly, an early strike team was sent to investigate psychic anomalies in the Carvos expanse. Minor warp turbulence, nothing the Mechanicum flagged as urgent, but when the team returned, only one member was alive, and he hadn't spoken a word in 3 weeks. Eventually, he started carving symbols into his own flesh. Not randomly, methodically, in patterns that pulsed when exposed to light. That survivor was executed, of course. But the data from his body was retained, and some say it's still referenced in certain Ordo Malleus containment procedures. This was the pattern. Teams sent to investigate warp echoes would either disappear or return. Wrong. But unlike the Xenos threats or mutant scourges, this wasn't something you could explain with science. Not completely. This was the moment when those first Proto-Inquisitors realized they weren't just cleaning up the galaxy. They were facing something ancient, intelligent, and hungry. Something that wore your voice, that knew your thoughts, and that could twist even the most loyal heart into a weapon. And yet, they kept going. That's the part that sticks with me. These weren't space marines, bred for war and fortified against the psychic horrors of the galaxy. These were humans, agents, scholars, investigators, and they walked into the warp's shadow over and over, taking notes, testing hypotheses, watching their colleagues succumb. They must have known what was happening to them. They must have felt the pull. And still they returned, because someone had to. That's what broke the system, in the end. The realization that these threats weren't rare anomalies. They were fundamental to the galaxy itself. The warp wasn't just dangerous, it was alive. And if it wasn't studied and contained, it would consume the Imperium from within. That's what forced the Emperor's hand, or perhaps what forced those closest to him to act in his name. The foundation of the Inquisition as a formal body wasn't about control. It was about survival. About creating an organization that could take these fractured, traumatized survivors of early chaos contact and forge them into something stronger. There's a theory, one I personally find compelling, that the first real Inquisitor wasn't named as such, but was the lone survivor of one of these missions. Someone who had seen the warp in its raw form, resisted it, and returned with knowledge too dangerous to ignore. Not a warrior, not a psyker, just someone who understood the stakes. And that individual, or others like them, became the blueprint for what the Inquisition needed to become. Autonomous, relentless, and capable of acting without hesitation or oversight. We often forget just how fragile the early Imperium was. Yes, it had the legions. Yes, it had the Emperor. But it didn't have experience with chaos on a galactic scale. That experience came at a price. And the price was paid by these early agents, many of whom never had names or whose names were erased to protect the living. Their sacrifices, their notes, their nightmares, they became the foundation of doctrine, the ashes from which the Ordo Malleus would one day rise. The formation of the sanctioned Inquisition was, in many ways, a quiet declaration of war against the warp. It was the point at which the Imperium realized that faith and force alone weren't enough. Knowledge, horrible, maddening knowledge, was necessary. And someone had to carry it. Someone had to become the archive, the blade, and the shield. But here's the tragic part. Most of those early agents never lived to see the structure they helped create. They were tools, used and discarded. Or worse, silenced because what they had seen made them too dangerous. Imagine surviving a warp incursion, warning your superiors, and being executed because your words echoed too closely to heresy. That happened more than once. And so the Inquisition wasn't born in a throne room or a council hall. It was born in 1,000 dying breaths, whispered in fear, etched into blood-stained journals, buried beneath layers of denial and terror. It was built on the backs of people who went into the abyss with nothing but instinct and duty, and came back broken, but burning with purpose. That's why I think it's important we talk about them. Because without those early encounters, those first sacrifices, the Imperium wouldn't have had a clue how to fight chaos, and we'd be living in a very different galaxy. Or not living at all. It's one thing to be forgotten by history. It's another to be deliberately erased. When you start piecing together the story of these pre-heresy inquisitorial factions, it becomes painfully clear that they didn't simply fade away. They were made to disappear. The question is, by whom and why? The most obvious explanation, and one that a lot of fans lean toward, is ideological conflict. These early operatives weren't just fighting Xenos and chaos. They were also wrestling with each other over what the Imperium should become. Some of them wanted total transparency, arguing that humanity couldn't survive the horrors of the galaxy unless it fully understood what it was up against. Others believed secrecy was paramount, that even acknowledging certain threats risked spreading their taint. This wasn't just a tactical disagreement. It was philosophical warfare. And when you're dealing with agents who operate in the shadows, ideological wars don't end in debates. They end in purges. There's evidence, obscure, fragmented, that some of these factions turned on each other, not in open rebellion, but in cold, precise moves. Disappearances, poisoned dispatches, doctored records. There's a reason the earliest years of inquisitorial activity are so hard to reconstruct. It's not just lost to time, it was edited. Redacted by people who didn't want their rivals remembered, or who wanted to reshape the narrative in their favor. That's the real horror behind it all. The idea that some of the most vital defenders of humanity's soul were undone, not by daemons or aliens, but by each other. And then there's the politics. We like to think the Inquisition stands above it all, aloof, incorruptible, immune to the scheming that infects the rest of the Imperium. But even in its earliest days, it was deeply political. These were agents who knew secrets no one else did, who could make or break Terry governors with a single accusation. That kind of power breeds enemies, especially among the High Lords of Terra, who were still consolidating control after the Emperor's withdrawal. There are whispers, always whispers, of alliances formed between noble houses and military branches to curtail the reach of certain inquisitorial factions. Some say early orders were deliberately isolated, denied reinforcements, cut off from supply chains, starved not by enemies but by friendly hands. One of the most haunting possibilities is betrayal from within. That some of these early agents were compromised, not just corrupted by chaos, but ideologically twisted. Paranoia is baked into the DNA of the Inquisition, and with good reason. When your job is to sniff out heresy, you start seeing it everywhere. In your comrades, in your superiors, in yourself. Some fan theories claim entire orders were wiped out because they suspected each other of treachery. And in an environment like that, suspicion is often enough. Better to silence a potential threat than risk contamination spreading. And this leads us to the idea of self-destruction. Not just metaphorical. Some of these factions, it's believed, initiated auto-purges, a kind of scorched earth policy. If they detected corruption in their ranks, or if they feared ideological deviation had gone too far, they erased themselves. Vaults sealed with no key. Agents ordered into reconditioning and never heard from again. Entire archives cleansed by plasma fire. It sounds insane, but that's the logic of a group built to hunt the impossible. When you become what you hunt, you must not be allowed to persist. It's also entirely possible that some of these lost factions weren't destroyed, but absorbed. Pieces of their doctrine, their records, their operatives may have been folded into the emerging structure of the post-heresy Inquisition. Sanitized, renamed, stripped of legacy. It's a cruel irony, but it fits the pattern. That the same Imperium that benefited from their sacrifices also buried their names to protect its own narrative. There's one case that really haunts me. A fragment of a transcript from a Terran tribunal believed to be from the last days of the Great Crusade. It mentions Order Nulli Veritas, an internal group charged with policing other inquisitorial cells. No official records exist of such an order, but the quote in the transcript reads, "They have seen too much. If they speak, the dream dies. Burn the records, seal the vault, leave no trace but guilt." If that's not a smoking gun, I don't know what is. In the end, I think the real reason these factions vanished comes down to one thing. The Imperium was never meant to be honest with itself. The truth they uncovered about the warp, about humanity, about the Emperor's designs, was too raw, too volatile. And so they were cut away, like a damaged limb, not because they were wrong, but because they were right. And that terrified the machine they helped build. That's the tragedy of it all. These were the first ones in. The first to bleed, the first to sacrifice their sanity for something bigger than themselves. And they were rewarded with silence. No statues, no titles, just erasure. And in the cold logic of the Imperium, maybe that's exactly what they wanted. Because if they're remembered, we might start asking the questions they died to hide. Here's the thing. Just because something is officially gone, erased from record and memory, doesn't mean it's truly vanished. In fact, in the Warhammer universe, that usually means the opposite. There's this running theme in Imperial history. The more aggressively something is denied, the more likely it is that it's still out there, lurking in the shadows. And that's exactly the case with the Pre-Heresy Inquisitorial factions. Because while the Administratum might tell you they never existed, the fanbase, and honestly, a few very compelling off-the-record sources, suggest otherwise. The term Phantom Orders has become something of a mythological label among lore divers and deep data lex archaeologists. These are supposed remnants of the forgotten inquisitorial cells, scattered across the galaxy like ghosts, operating without sanction, without recognition, but still very much active. Their sigils don't match any known Ordos. Their methods are strange, outdated, almost ritualistic. And their agents? Never named. Just described. Always in hushed tones. Always one step behind the stories we're supposed to believe. There's a pattern I've seen crop up in a few rare incident reports. They come from widely different sectors, even different millennia, but they all describe the same thing: an unknown agent intervening in moments of extreme psychic or warp instability. The agents don't wear standard rosettes, they don't identify themselves, but they issue commands, override local authority, and vanish after neutralizing the anomaly. And when administratum scribes try to follow up, the data is gone, not redacted, gone. Like the record was never written. That kind of precision smells of something old, something trained before protocols were even protocols. And then there are the sightings, dozens of them, maybe more if you dig into apocryphal Crusade logs and Black Vault testimonies. My personal favorite comes from a penal legion detachment stationed in the Morin depths. During a warp incursion, the entire regiment was incapacitated, and the survivors claim that a group of tall, pale individuals in armor they couldn't identify appeared out of nowhere. No insignias, no heraldry, just silence, extreme psychic pressure, and surgical execution of the demonic presence. When the storm cleared, they were gone. No warp trail, no transport signatures, just the smell of burnt ozone and a single word etched into the wall: observe. That kind of detail is too specific to be pure invention. And that's the thing with these stories, they're consistent in the ways that matter. They suggest methodology, pattern, a doctrine handed down through centuries by groups that should no longer exist. Which raises the question, are these truly remnants of the old orders, or are they something entirely new that has inherited their purpose? There's a theory, one I'm particularly fond of, that some of the early factions went underground, not because they were hunted, but because they chose to. That they saw the corruption of centralized authority coming and removed themselves before it could infect their mission. These cells might still operate today, watching from afar, intervening only when the threat reaches a level the official Ordos can't handle, or aren't willing to admit exists. Some even believe that the Officio Assassinorum may have been partially co-opted by one of these ghost orders. Not the official clades we all know about, but something deeper. A 13th clade, unofficial and unacknowledged, whose operatives have no masters and answer only to a forgotten creed. You won't find evidence of this in the temple archives, of course, but you will find unexplained kill patterns in sectors that weren't supposed to have inquisitorial presence. Anomalies in the execution logs, mission reports missing timestamps. That kind of ghost data tends to only mean one thing in the Imperium. Someone doesn't want you asking questions. Another angle that gets thrown around is the possibility that some of these phantom orders have retreated into non-Euclidean space, hidden stations within the warp itself, or deep within null zones where time flows differently and detection is impossible. If that's true, then these agents wouldn't just be forgotten. They'd be timeless, operating across millennia, appearing in moments of greatest need like something out of legend. Not quite alive, not quite dead, but undeniably human in origin. What fascinates me most is how these stories persist across cultures and regions of the Imperium. Hive-world scribes speak of the Quiet Eye, a symbol said to appear before psychic purges. Death cults in the Ultima Segmentum venerate the Pale Voice, an entity said to walk with the will of the true Inquisition, not the one bound in chains of bureaucracy. Even some renegade Mechanicum sects speak of Protocol Obscurus, a data ghost that corrupts systems to erase knowledge deemed unsafe, allegedly derived from ancient Terran software created by pre-heresy inquisitors. Are these just legends, mutated over 10,000 years of fear and silence? Maybe. But maybe that's exactly how the orders want it. Legends can't be questioned. They can't be summoned to testify. They exist in a space of reverence and fear, which might be the only safe space left for those who once knew too much. Because let's be honest, if any of these phantom orders have survived, they're not the heroes in shining armor we might hope for. They've been operating in the dark for too long. They've seen what the galaxy really is, and they've had to make decisions no one else would dare. They're not noble. They're necessary, and if they ever step fully into the light again, it'll mean things have gone so horribly wrong that even the forgotten have to rise. If you go looking for the old orders, the pre-heresy ones no one's supposed to talk about, you won't find names or battle honors. There won't be banners or shrines. What you'll find, if you're lucky, are fragments, little things, a piece of armor with a sigil no one recognizes, a data slate with a language that doesn't match any known cipher, a weapon that shouldn't exist, tucked away in a forgotten vault, tagged for incineration but mysteriously spared. These aren't relics enshrined by the ecclesiarchy. They're ghosts, scattered across the Imperium like breadcrumbs left behind by those who were never meant to be remembered. Let's talk about the armor first. There are whispers about a suit of power armor known only as Pattern Upsilon 4. It doesn't match any recognized mark, not Mark 1 through Mark X. The plates are sleeker, more segmented, covered in a matte black coating that absorbs light, no Aquila, no Legion markings, just a single recessed rune over the heart, a spiral inside a broken circle. This armor has allegedly turned up at least 3 times across the past 5,000 years. Once in the possession of a dead rogue trader found adrift near the Maelstrom, once in a sealed Mechanicum crate buried beneath an inquisitorial fortress, and once worn during a warp incursion purge on Ophelia's 7th by someone no one could identify. After each sighting, the armor disappeared again, as if it didn't want to be found, or someone didn't want it to be found. Then there are the weapons. You'll find mentions of them in the black margins of Munitorum requisition forms, items listed under obsolete tags, withdrawn under pre-Great Crusade classification codes. Things like the Apostate's Nail, a long-barreled bolt weapon with ammo inscriptions written in ancient Terran dialects not even the Lex Imperialis recognizes. supposedly fires rounds laced with something that doesn't quite fit any chemical profile in use today. Some even say the rounds don't explode, they erase, as if rewriting causality at the point of impact. Too dangerous to reproduce, yet too effective to destroy. And then there's the real gold, the texts. The ideologues and operational doctrines of these early orders. They don't appear in normal archives, obviously. But sometimes, in the personal libraries of radical inquisitors, or in Mechanicum data shrines no one has dared purge in millennia, there are tomes and slates that don't belong. One that keeps coming up in obscure circles is The 9 Refusals of Truth. It's not a book in the traditional sense, more like a collection of psycho-reactive instructions. It doesn't teach you how to resist heresy. It teaches you why resistance may not be enough, why the truth must sometimes be destroyed before it spreads. Some say it's an ideological cornerstone of a long-dead order dedicated to fighting knowledge itself. There's a pattern to how these items resurface. They rarely appear in open circulation. It's always private auctions, secret inheritances, or looted vaults cracked open by mistake. And when someone does get their hands on one, really get close to it, bad things start to happen. Memory loss, unexplained paranoia, recurring dreams that don't feel like dreams. That's the thing. These aren't just historical curiosities. They carry weight, intent, like echoes of the minds that used them, burned into their very atoms. Some fans believe these items are passed down deliberately, hand to hand across generations of radical agents who still carry the legacy of the Forgotten Orders. Not formally, not with titles or ceremonies. Just a look, a phrase, a package delivered without a return address. You'll know what to do, the note might say. And somehow, the recipient always does. Maybe that's superstition. Or maybe there's a deeper code embedded in this hidden lineage. One that was never written down, only felt. One particularly strange case I always come back to is the Calith fragment. Discovered in the ruins of an obliterated research station orbiting a dead world near the halo stars, it's a hexagonal data core that defies conventional decoding. Every tech priest who's tried to access it has suffered neurological seizures, except one who claimed to hear voices in perfect low Gothic describing events from the dark age of technology. The Mechanicum sealed the core, stamped it with a triple Xeno threat designation, and buried it under a Titan forge. But rumor has it, an Inquisitor retrieved it 2 centuries ago, and since then, all record of both the artifact and the Inquisitor have gone dark. The implication is clear. These things, these weapons, artifacts, doctrines, they were never supposed to outlive the orders that created them. But somehow, they have. And they don't just exist, they move. They find their way back into circulation, despite every effort to suppress them. That kind of persistence implies something bigger. Not just that the old orders left behind remnants, but that their mission, in some form, continues. That someone, somewhere, still believes in what they were trying to do. And maybe that's what keeps them alive. Not official records, not monuments, but intention. Passed on not through titles or rank, but through the quiet agreement between those who understand the real threats and what must be done when no one else is willing. Because at the end of the day, relics are more than metal and parchment. They're proof. Proof that the galaxy once knew defenders who answered to no High Lord, no Ecclesiarch. Not even to the institutions that claim to guard mankind today. They answered to truth. And that truth, though buried, still flickers in the dark, waiting for someone to find it. When it comes to the old, forgotten orders, the modern Ordo Hereticus and Ordo Malleus walk a strange, uneasy line, somewhere between denial and reverence. It's like they're staring into a mirror, but the reflection is older, cracked, and full of things they're not ready to acknowledge. They owe everything to those first agents, those silent warriors who faced the warp and the unknown without codexes, without sanction, without any of the institutional power that these modern ordos now wield like a badge of holiness. And yet, they don't talk about them. Not publicly, not officially. It's like the past has teeth, and speaking its name might wake something the Imperium can't control. Let's start with Ordo Hereticus. These are the watchdogs of thought, the arbiters of purity, the Inquisition's self-appointed conscience. You'd think they'd be the first to preserve the legacies of those who came before, right? But no. In most recorded cases where early orders are mentioned, especially those that dabbled in ideological deviation, experimental doctrine, or Xenos diplomacy, Hereticus redacts, buries, rewrites. There's even a term they've used in old archives, contaminated precedent. That's how they classify early inquisitorial texts that don't conform to the modern understanding of orthodoxy. Not heresy, just contaminated. Impure by proximity to a time when the Inquisition didn't yet have a rulebook. And that's the heart of it. Hereticus thrives on rules, on dogma, on the comforting rigidity of what is allowed and what isn't. The early orders were fluid, messy, morally gray. Exactly the kind of ambiguity that Hereticus finds threatening. So they deal with that history the same way the Imperium deals with most inconvenient truths. They suppress it. Or worse, they reinterpret it. You'll find examples where actions clearly attributed to forgotten orders are instead relabeled as unsanctioned agents, radical cells, or simply disavowed incidents. It's erasure, but done politely, bureaucratically, with just enough plausible deniability to avoid attracting the attention of more curious minds. But not everyone in Hereticus toes that line. There are radicals, even now, who believe that the old ways held wisdom that the modern Ordos have lost. These inquisitors collect fragments of pre-heresy doctrine, study archaic weaponry, and hunt down descendants of those early agents, not to purge them, but to learn. They call it ancestral clarity. Of course they keep it quiet, because the moment someone in Hereticus discovers they're venerating a ghost order, the autoquill starts writing up a purity audit. And we all know how those end. Now, Ordo Malleus is a bit more complicated. Their relationship with the past is more conflicted. On one hand, they're incredibly proud of their lineage. They see themselves as the final evolution of those early demon hunters who first stared into the warp and didn't flinch. Some even speak in hushed tones of the unnamed doctrines, operational principles passed down not through books, but through whispered traditions. Field rituals, patterns of engagement, mantras that don't appear in any sanctioned codex, but are taught by older inquisitors to their acolytes with the understanding that this is how it's always been done. That reverence, though, is always veiled, never formal, never recorded. Because even Malleus knows that too much attention on the old orders could unravel things, could make people start asking questions like, why were these predecessors erased? What did they know that we're not allowed to? Why do some of their doctrines work better than the ones we have now? There's a story, a persistent one, echoed across multiple subsectors, about a Malleus inquisitor named Thasser Vale. Apparently, he spent over a century tracking warp anomalies that aligned perfectly with symbols found on a relic believed to be tied to a lost order. The deeper he dug, the more connections he found, similar psychic frequencies, identical demonic response patterns. He tried to present his findings to the conclave. The result? Immediate censure. His rosette revoked. All his research classified under Threat Index Obscurus. He disappeared 6 months later. And now, any mention of Vale is met with silence. That kind of reaction doesn't scream fiction, it screams fear. Even the Grey Knights, those most sacred of Malleus instruments, show signs of knowing more than they let on. Their librarius contains tomes older than the chapter itself, sealed with bindings not even senior brothers are permitted to open. Some suspect these contain records of early inquisitorial operations against demonic entities. Possibly even direct knowledge passed down from the very agents who survived those first, raw encounters. The Knights don't talk about it, of course. But their silence is telling, and here's where the theories get wild. Some believe that Ordo Malleus knows the old orders didn't vanish, that they simply stepped outside the bounds of conventional authority, that Malleus maintains secret communication lines with surviving fragments of these ancient factions, using them as black operatives for missions too extreme, too delicate, or too heretical for official channels. It's impossible to prove, but there are enough unexplained ops, enough anomalous victories, to make you wonder. So what's the real policy then? Is it suppression? Veneration? Something in between? The answer is maddeningly imperial. It depends who you ask. Some inquisitors deny the orders ever existed. Others risk their lives to preserve their legacy. Most pretend not to care, and yet tighten their grip on their data vaults whenever someone asks about the past. To me, that says everything. These orders left behind more than relics. They left behind questions. Dangerous ones. The kind that cut through doctrine and strike at the foundations of imperial truth. And if the modern Inquisition treats them like ghosts, maybe it's because they're afraid of what might happen if those ghosts ever decide to speak. Now this is the part where things really start to spiral into the deep end. Not because it's nonsense, but because the lines between theory and truth in the Warhammer galaxy are always blurred. And when something is so deliberately buried, it only makes the whispers louder. Over the years, countless fan theories have emerged about who the Pre-Heresy Inquisitorial factions really were, and what their purpose might have been. Some theories are grounded in grim realism, others veer into high-concept conspiracy, but all of them, every single one, point to one truth that's hard to ignore. These orders mattered. And the more you pull on the thread, the more you realize someone worked very hard to make sure we never saw the whole picture. One of the most persistent theories is that these early orders weren't simply precursors to the modern Inquisition. They were something else entirely. Not just investigators or hunters, but a kind of hybrid entity that blurred the lines between multiple arms of the Proto-Imperium. Some believe they were directly connected to the Emperor's Praetorians, the personal bodyguards and secret agents who operated on his word alone before even the custodes were formally codified in their role. According to this theory, these agents were part of a broader internal mechanism, a last line of trust that the Emperor could rely on to act without oversight. Not warriors, not bureaucrats, executors of his will in its purest, most terrifying form. It's not far-fetched when you think about it. The Emperor was always several steps ahead of everyone else. If he anticipated the rise of chaos, and I believe he did, then he would have needed agents who could prepare the way, neutralize threats, and gather forbidden knowledge before it consumed humanity. Some say these orders were the test phase of that idea. Others think they were more than that. Some even theorize they were the first proto-perpetuals, mortals elevated for their insight and utility, not through gene seed, but through arcane psychic pacts or forgotten technologies. Not immortal, but difficult to kill. Almost like living vaults for the Imperium's darkest secrets. Another widely circulated theory connects the Lost Orders to the Officio Assassinorum, especially to the lesser-known clades, the ones we never hear about in official documents. Sure, we know about Vindicare, Eversor, Calidus, and Tulexus, but there are rumors of at least 2 other clades that were either wiped out or absorbed. Some fans believe these mystery clades weren't pure assassins at all, but hybrids of espionage, interrogation, and execution squads that had roots in inquisitorial practice. Imagine agents trained not just to kill, but to judge, extract, interpret. Ghost operatives who didn't report to any High Lord, but answered only to doctrine, whispered through sealed vaults under Terra itself. Then there's the wild one, the link between the Old Orders and the Grey Knights. And I know, that sounds like tinfoil hat territory at first, but bear with me. There are theories suggesting that the mysterious founding of the Grey Knights wasn't just the work of Malcador and his chosen few after the heresy, but the culmination of work begun by these forgotten agents long before Horus ever fell. That the psychic purity, the ritual precision, the unshakable purpose of the Grey Knights was modeled not after Astartes' doctrine, but after these early, unknown inquisitors who dared to interact with demonic knowledge without losing their souls. Maybe they were the first who figured out how to resist the warp, not through brute strength, but through controlled insanity. And maybe some of them became the foundation stones of Titan itself. And let's not forget the parallels to the Legio Custodes. While they're the golden warriors, shining and absolute in their loyalty, there are odd references buried in accounts from the Unification Wars of shadowy operatives working beneath even them. Agents who would arrive in silence, operate without announcement, and leave without ceremony. Some even say that during the burning of ancient Terran temples, it wasn't the custodes who neutralized psychic cults. It was someone else, someone darker. That profile fits the early orders too well to ignore. Silent, precise, detached, but never aimless. One of the most fascinating ideas I've ever come across links the Lost Orders to a concept called the Shadow Accord. Supposedly, this was a Terran-era secret pact between various proto-imperial factions, the Mechanicum, early Librarius agents, rogue psyker enclaves, and certain noble houses, all working together to preserve knowledge the Emperor had forbidden. Not in defiance, but in preparation. Because they believed that one day, the Imperium would need to know what it had chosen to forget. According to this theory, the orders were born from this accord. A collective agreement that when the time came, someone had to be ready to lift the veil. Of course, not all theories are so noble. Some claim that the lost orders were corrupted, that they didn't fall in a blaze of glory or martyrdom, but in rot. That they began with pure intentions, but the weight of secrets, exposure to the warp, and unchecked authority twisted them. Some suggest that what we call chaos cults today might have roots in fallen inquisitorial factions who went too deep and never came back. That the price of knowledge is transformation, and that some of these agents didn't resist it. They embraced it. Then there's the most unsettling theory of all, the one that loops back to the beginning. What if the orders never disappeared because they never truly existed as separate entities? What if they were always part of something bigger? An algorithm of control set in motion by the Emperor himself, designed to fracture, evolve, die, and reincarnate as needed, changing names, faces, and symbols but never purpose. What if the Forgotten Orders are still with us, not as ghosts, but as the software beneath the operating system of the modern Inquisition? Honestly, that one keeps me up at night. Because in a galaxy built on secrets, the biggest ones aren't the ones hidden in vaults. They're the ones walking beside us, wearing different faces, speaking with different voices, but always watching. And if the old orders are still out there, even in fragmentary form, maybe we're not ready for them to return. Or maybe they never left. When we talk about the Forgotten Orders, the ones that came before the Inquisition as we know it, we're not just exploring a piece of obscure history. We're looking into a crack in the armor of the Imperium itself. A place where things weren't yet codified, where decisions were raw, personal, and often tragic. These agents didn't act because of doctrine or decree. They acted because they had to, because no one else would. And in doing so, they built the very foundations of what it means to stand against the darkness. It matters because these were the first ones to see the real face of the galaxy. Before the walls were high and the dogma was thick, before the Golden Throne was a prison and not a symbol, these people fought not for power, not even for survival, but for understanding. They stared into the warp when it was still just a whisper. They cataloged the alien when everyone else still believed humanity was alone. They rooted out corruption before the ecclesiarchy ever named it. And they did it knowing they wouldn't be thanked. Knowing maybe that they wouldn't be remembered. Their legacy is painful, complicated, full of contradictions. They were idealists and monsters, visionaries and executioners. But they were also human. And maybe that's why the Imperium needed to erase them. Because they weren't perfect. They questioned things, they disagreed, they made mistakes. And in a galaxy that thrives on certainty, on absolutes, that's terrifying. But if anything, their story shows us that the Imperium didn't always look the way it does now. That once upon a time, there was space for interpretation, for experimentation, even for rebellion in the name of survival. It makes you wonder, what did we lose when we chose the safety of dogma over the danger of questioning? How many tools did we lock away because we were afraid of what they might reveal? There's a kind of poetry in the way their remnants still echo through the galaxy. In unmarked artifacts, in unsanctioned kill teams, in half-remembered doctrines whispered in the halls of Titan. They've become the ghost in the machine, the unknown variable. The possibility that the Imperium has tried to standardize itself into security, but at the cost of flexibility, of resilience. And maybe, someday, we'll need what they left behind. When the next great threat comes, when chaos shifts, or the veil between realities begins to thin again. Maybe it'll be their forgotten wisdom, not a sermon, not a purity seal, that saves us. I think in some ways, that's what draws people to this topic so strongly. Not just the mystery or the lost history, but the humanity of it all. These weren't demigods or gene-crafted superweapons. They were people who chose to act, to resist, to disappear rather than compromise. And that's incredibly powerful. And hey, if you followed me this far, thank you. I know this was a deep dive, maybe darker than usual, But I think it's worth it, because every time we peel back a layer of Imperial history, we're reminded that the Imperium is not a monolith. It's a story, one made of choices, of secrets, of those who vanished into the dark so others could walk in the light. If this resonated with you, if you want to keep digging into the hidden corners of the lore, the theories that aren't always comfortable but are too fascinating to ignore, then stick around. Subscribe, drop a comment, share your own thoughts, because there's more out there, and together, maybe we can find it. After all, in a galaxy this vast, even the forgotten can find a voice again.